I'm very grateful to have Dr. Thomas Booth here to launch the series. So Tom studies archaeological science and then human osteology and funerary anthropology, and finally for a PhD in bioarchaeology at Sheffield, which is, as you all know, the place to study these kind of things. He then moved to London on a Wellcome Trust-funded project to the Natural History Museum, sequencing DNA from human remains recovered from Britain to investigate migration and natural selection. He's now a senior researcher at the Crick Institute, working on another Wellcome-funded project, looking to sequence genomes from at least 1,000 people who lived in Britain over the last 10,000 years. The idea would be to build an ancient UK biobank that could be used to investigate human evolution, health, and disease in the past and the present. And now today he's offering us a paper that is extraordinarily interdisciplinary, actually, grounded in that research, but opening up to larger vistas.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, this is something I would normally find a situation I would find myself in naturally. So thanks to David for sort of positing a sort of provocative question about whether we can investigate sexualized violence using some of the data that we get from DNA analysis. And sort of that inspired me to kind of look through literature and see what we can say about that, and whether some of the patterns in the ancient DNA that we see can somehow be related to sexual violence in, say, Greek mythology. But to begin with, just the end of the talk first. Just a big, just to give a sense of my view of the question. I'm just going to start with this. I don't think it can, but I think it's still an interesting idea to explore, partly because I think it explores the way that ancient DNA studies are misunderstood, particularly by the press and communicated compared to the studies themselves. And there's still a use, I think, in thinking about Greek myths and perhaps ancient Greek culture more generally through this prism of migrations which that happened in the ancient past, which may have influenced it and led to the development of Indo-European languages and different cultures. So, just to begin with, many of you might already be aware that archaeogenetics, ancient DNA, has really taken off in the past 10 years or so, and it's largely because this next generation sequencing technology, new sequencing technology, has meant that the cost of sequencing has plummeted, and we're able to generate a lot more data than we used to be able to. That means that 10 years ago we had maybe a handful, a dozen or so of genomes from ancient individuals. Now we have over 10,000 genomes from people that have been developed from all over the world. And I'm going to talk a lot in this talk about genetic ancestries. It's probably important to define what we mean by this. And ancestry is, in a way that is defined in genetics, is formed, and the definition can vary depending on the questions you're asking and what you're studying, but broadly speaking, it's formed by structure in genetic data, so patterns of relatedness where you get groups of people, whether because of geography or culture, are more genetically related to each other than others outside of it, and so have recent shared ancestry. And this is defined by shared patterns of admixture, so they have and drift. So they have a shared history of, in their recent population, history of mixing between different populations as well as isolation. So this is genetically you change even if there's no admixture from elsewhere, just because your genome is randomly mutating, and so as a population your genome changes because of random mutation that's happening by chance. So that mixture of those two things helps define these genetic ancestries, and there's no correct way to define them. You can define them on multiple scales. You can talk about genetic ancestries on sort of continental-wide scales, or you can talk about genetic ancestries down to extended families. It's basically the scale that you use is based on the questions that you're asking and what you want to know. And yeah, genetic ancestry is always changing. And it should be said that genetic ancestry is not genealogy, and this is sort of counterintuitive to people's conception of genetics and ancestry, and that as you go further and further back, the number of your ancestors each generation is increasing exponentially. But while your genome is a really rich source of information, it's finite. So there's only a certain amount of space for genetic ancestors to sit in your genetics. So when you get past a certain number of generations, or 10 generations or so, people who are your genealogical ancestors start to drop out of your genetics. So this is a graph of when you get 17 generations back, the red is the number of genealogical ancestors you have, and the blue is the proportion that you've inherited any DNA from. So it's a tiny proportion, but because you're more likely to have inherited DNA from people who lived in the place where you're from or your ancestors are from, your genome contains the population history of, you're more likely to inherit DNA from people who lived in that area in the past. So your DNA, while containing a tiny proportion of your overall ancestors, reflects the sort of population history of the groups that you're descended from. So this sort of Russian doll effect of who they've inherited DNA from, who they've inherited DNA from, etc. And migration in archaeology as well as linguistics has always been thought as a plausible vector of language change, because language and culture are often highly heritable. Even when groups move, there's often, although not always, and not always in a one-to-one relationship, a tendency to persist in certain cultural and linguistic traditions that were practiced in the place that it came from. And there's, in archaeogenetics, because archaeogenetics has allowed us really for the first time to be able to see the impacts of migrations directly rather than having to rely on proxies like changes in the material record. There's perhaps become an over-reliance on migrations and explanatory factor, or at least of cultural change in the archaeological record, or at least sort of not thinking too hard about what the mechanism is, rather than you say, well, it's just migration, but you're not really thinking about how it works. And this pattern of migration influencing cultural change and linguistic change, it tends to work on a broad scale generally, but there are always exceptions and specific details that it finds that it's difficult to explain based on such a simple model. And diversity in both the genetics and the cultures it derives from interactions with the local populations and migrants. And there's clever ways of looking at sex-biased migration or admixture, where you can identify if. So in genetics, often we can only identify the migration in terms of the long-term effects if the people who migrated then had children in the place that we're from. So we have to emphasize that we're very much looking at reproduction here, not so much transient migration. And we do pick up on that sometimes. They have to have more often had a child in the place that they went to in order for us to see it in the genetics. So we can see whether a change in the genetics of people in a particular region was mediated by largely movements of males or females or both, because firstly, because you have this bit of DNA called the mitochondrial DNA, which you inherit from your mother, and it doesn't recombine, so beyond some random mutations, it more or less stays the same. So, and there are all these different types of mitochondrial DNA that you can classify. So if you see a big change in the ancestry, and similarly for genetic karyotypic males, they have a Y chromosome, and if you're a male, you inherit your Y chromosome from a father. So we have two markers there of paternal and maternal descent. So if you have a change in a population's overall ancestry and no change in their mitochondrial DNA, that would suggest that it's probably a male-mediated migration, or the opposite way around. If you have a migration that changes the whole ancestry, and you have a big change in the Y chromosome, but no change. So a big change in the mitochondrial DNA, but no change in the Y chromosome, it means it's female-mediated. You can also do these clever things because these unique parental markers are subject to these mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome can change for other reasons. You can also look at the X chromosomes. So karyotypic females carry two X chromosomes, and males carry an X and a Y. And because of that, it means that the ancestry in the population of a whole on the X chromosome, given equal rates of admixture, you would expect that 2/3 of the ancestry in a population on the X chromosomes would come from female and 1/3 from the male. So what you do is compare the ancestry proportions on the X chromosome compared to the whole ancestry. And if, for instance, there's less of a particular type of ancestry on the X chromosome than there is in the whole ancestry, that would suggest that it's more of a male-mediated introduction of that ancestry. So there's lots of different, there's sort of clever methods based on biological descent that you can use to look at ancestry. And the ancestry, in terms of the relevance to this particular question that is most relevant, is this what's called the Western steppe herder or steppe-related ancestry that forms on the Pontic-Caspian steppe from around 4000 BC and is associated with a family of cultures known as the Yamnai or Picray culture. So kind of this pink region here, and this is actually comprised of, when all of these ancestries I'm going to talk about are actually comprised of different ancestries that have mixed together at different times. So this is actually a mixture of ancestry from further south in the Caucasus and further west and north is the sort of Eastern European ancestry. And those ancestries themselves are comprised of mixtures of ancestries, just to give a sense that these aren't coherent in that sense. They're all mixtures at some level. And in 2015, two ancient DNA groups, David Reich's group in Harvard University in the US and S.K. Willis's group in Copenhagen, published simultaneously two papers in Nature which basically found the same thing, that from around 3000 BC in Central and Eastern Europe, we see a massive influx of ancestry from the steppe-related ancestry and they hypothesized that it was this migration and resultant shift in ancestry that was responsible for the spread of Indo-European languages. Sorry, that's overwritten a bit, but yeah, so, and this, over the 3rd millennium BC, people carrying these Western steppe herder ancestries dispersed across most of Europe with different impacts in different parts of Europe. And in Central and Eastern Europe, they're responsible, their migration and mixture with the local population seems to be responsible for the development of this corded ware family of cultures in Central Europe. And then the people who were associated with those corded ware cultures themselves expand later on and eventually end up in northern India, as well as expanding into the rest of Europe. So you have this initial expansion from these Yamnai associated people having corded ware. And this is why, because this sort of steppe ancestry in living people is associated with speaking Indo-European languages, these migrations are seen as a plausible vector of spreading Indo-European languages. Although, as I said, it explains the general trend, there are some specifics which it finds difficult to explain. For instance, the Basque do have, also have minor proportions of this Western steppe herder ancestry, but do not speak an Indo-European language. So there's different regional processes going on. And often when you get these people turning up with these steppe ancestries, it's accompanied by a larger turnover in paternal lineages and maternal lineages, and a large turnover in paternal lineages than you see in the whole ancestry of a similar level. And there's suggestions here of male biased migration. And this analysis that I spoke about the X chromosome suggested there's less steppe ancestry on the Y chromosome compared to the rest of the genome, so again suggests that it's male biased, although not exclusively male. And this has only really been done for the initial series of migrations that lead to the development of corded ware, not as much for the subsequent migrations. Because we have to bear in mind that this isn't, while it's fast in archaeological terms, these migrations are happening over a period of over 1,000 years. So, particularly getting around the entirety of Europe. So it's not necessarily such a sudden shock. But certainly there's evidence that migrations associated with the development of corded ware involve more migrating men having children with local women. And sort of feeding into how this fits in terms of thinking about the sort of ideologies and the patterns of the way in which this male-mediated migration might work and ancestry change might work. People have looked at sort of patterns of kinship in cemeteries, because there's the other thing that we can do with DNA, we can look at genetic relatives within cemeteries. And this was the first study that really did this nicely in an early Bronze Age cemetery in the Lech Valley in Germany. So this is quite a bit later, but these groups were descendants, more or less, of those migrations from the steppe, or assumed to at least have something similar in terms of have some similar cultural traits. And what they found is that you can see that in the cemeteries there was a lot of men that were related to each other. Not only that, but they tended to be buried with the same grave goods, so there was that paternal inheritance pattern in terms of getting buried with these copper daggers. It seems like the women were non-local, and you also had richer burials and the more poor burials with less grave goods, and they seem to be that the richer burials are more likely to contain these male relatives, the poorer burials were more likely to be non-relatives. And they compared it to, well, they suggested that certainly a patrilocal or patrilineal system in terms of who's ending up in these cemeteries, and potentially patrilocality with female exogamy. And it was compared in a paper to, I think slightly spuriously, to ancient Greek oikos, where you have a core family, core family who are living on these farmsteads, and then their servants or slaves buried around them, although there could be lots of different ways of interpreting these patterns. And these sorts of potential patrilineal patterns have been interpreted in terms of Indo-European ethno-linguistic reconstructions, which use commonalities in Indo-European languages to try and reconstruct sort of the original Indo-European language to some extent, and then from that infer aspects of their sort of social structure, society, how they operate. And suggestions from ethno-linguistic reconstructions is that they were the original Indo-European speakers were sort of very patrilineal and potentially patriarchal. This comes from the fact that there's lots of different names for your paternal relatives, but not your maternal relatives, suggesting that people move to live with, well, there's female exogamy, women move to live with their paternal, with their sort of husband's family. And you also, in this sort of reconstructed Indo-European and ethno-linguistic approach, have this chorus idea that bands of young men, particularly younger brothers, would band together and raid other societies, and generally caused mayhem. And this was used by, in this paper, Christiansen et al., as a model for how migrants dispersed across Europe, that's how these migrations happened. So these Amnaya migrants moved into these territories of what were nearly farmers, and then the implication is that some of this would have involved sexualized violence, rape, taking of captives, which is why the sex-biased admixture is male-biased. So they used this particular model and applied it, and the implication was that across the 3rd millennium BC, all the movements of people with step-derived ancestries, even after mixtures with local people across Europe, sort of involved this model to some extent. And this sort of fed into sort of popular reporting of these sorts of migrations. I mean, I could pick on a lot of different stories, but this story from a very hyperbole-filled story about Yamnai migrations. And so this is sort of probably the point at which David's question came from, that with this idea of potentially these step pastoralists raping, flying away across Europe, do classical stories of sexualized violence, preserve some folk memory of these sorts of events. In sort of deconstructing this, these population replacements that we talk about, what does it actually mean? And it tends to be that, population replacement is a term from biology that's usually applied to non-human animals. And if you're talking about population replacement of one day by another, there's kind of nothing else implied in it apart from a change in ancestry. But when you talk about population replacement of humans, people bring a lot of baggage with what that actually means. But all population means is that there's been a substantial shift in ancestry over a particular time scale. And the time scales that we're talking about here are large, centuries of them, than millennia. Genetics can tell us how that change happened, but there's only limited things that it can do to tell us how it happened, what the mechanism of change. And so population replacement does not equate to directly to invasion and conquest. At its heart, what it means is that when one population moved in with a certain ancestry, that over a certain amount of time, they were able to produce more ancestors that themselves lived to adulthood. So they had a greater genetic legacy than the local populations that they encountered. And you can't rule out violence and conquest. It's certainly one possibility, but there are lots of other factors that can influence this: infant mortality, unequal access to resources, so social structure, lifestyle, fertility, etc. And so the DNA is difficult to distinguish between all of these scenarios using the DNA by itself. You need to integrate it with the archaeological, historical evidence to really come up with what you think could be responsible for the ancestry change. Whereas really, particularly the way that it's interpreted through the press, and to be fair, a lot of people take this, is that population replacement is that a bunch of people moved in, murdered all the men, carried off all the women, but that's not what it necessarily means, or you have to be able to prove that that's what it means in other ways. And when we look closely at admixture and migration across Europe of these steppe ancestries, it's really regionally variable. And the problem is that there's very little archaeological evidence that periods where steppe migrations were happening and people carrying these steppe ancestries moved into new areas happened, that there was it was particularly violent. There was an increase in violence. There are certain places where there is evidence for this, but it's really patchy and regionally variable. And there's evidence that, and in Britain particularly, which is primarily what I study, that there was persistence of groups, of the local and incoming groups for sometimes hundreds of years alongside one another before they merged together, and then for whatever reason, the local group had, the incoming group had a greater ancestral legacy. So this is sort of a graph of ancestry and people in Britain from around 2500 BC all the way to sort of, well, I mean, that's not relevant, but from 12,000 BC. And what you see is, this is the amount of ancestry that essentially comes from the population that we had before these steppe migrants arrived. And you can see that they have, most of this ancestry comes from the fact that they've mixed with people in continental Europe who have similar ancestry to Britain. But you can see that most of them have just essentially the ancestry that comes in with these migrants that's derived from these communities of migrants that start moving into Britain from around 2500 BC. But you can see there's all these outliers that have higher levels of the sort of local ancestry. So there has to be other communities of people that we don't see in the archaeological record, probably because they were cremating the dead, which is what they were doing before the migrants arrived, that are sort of occasionally admixing with this population that we see in the archaeological record and sort of slowly merging together. And then what you get around 2000 BC or so is a slight uptick in the ancestry from local groups, which suggests that they've sort of totally merged together. So there's this process of over 500 years of these groups merging together. And I don't doubt that some of that will involve tensions and violence, but it's not the sort of wipeout model that it's and violent model that it's necessarily led to. And similarly with variation in sex-based biased admixture, it's very regionally varied. In some places it seems to be more sex biased, in others it's not at all. So in Britain, for instance, and this is just a graph of what you would expect if, for this Chorus model where you have initially men moving in and having children with local women or carrying off local women, is that you would get a pulse of the local admixture. Because obviously if they're only having children with the local women, that means that at least 50% of the ancestry of the children born from that have to come from the local population. So you would expect that you would see a pulse of admixture in this model, and then it would settle down very quickly. But actually, this is just a chart of the dates of the people studied in different regions, so around 2500, 2000 BC. And these are the dates of when they can date the admixture to, so when they admixed with the local groups. And what you see is, rather than an early pulse, in some places you do see more of an early pulse, like in, also I think it's the other way around, but this is the admixture, and that's the date of the individuals. So here, for instance, in Germany, you do see a pulse where it's happening earlier, but in other places it's sort of, like in Britain, for instance, the two lines are together, so they're basically consistent admixture and melding together of two populations. So again, with and in Britain and in other places, you get a 95% genetic turnover over this 500-year period. And in order to get a change that big, there has to have involved migrations of women and men and communities of people. Interestingly, on the Orkney Islands, what you get is that you get whole ancestry change, 95% ancestry change, but no change in the paternal haplogroups. And if you were to take this sort of model that's been applied elsewhere, that would imply that you have Orkney being invaded by female warriors who killed all the men and carried off killed all the women and carried off all the men. So, I mean, it could have happened, who knows? But it sort of speaks to the idea that this is potentially more of a social political process that's going on, intermarriage between different communities and different people having different potentially status within society, and therefore over hundreds of years their ancestry persists for longer, but persists more continuously. So moving on to Greece specifically, this is kind of the punchline to all of this and to why it kind of spoils the whole story when you look at any link when you look at Greece. So between 8,000 to 2000 BC, the genetics of people living in what's now Greece is largely defined by interactions with Anatolia. There's a couple of main pulses of migrations, one at the beginning of the Neolithic and one at the beginning of the Bronze Age, which sort of slightly changed the ancestry. We don't see this Western steppe herder ancestry coming into mainland Greece until 2000 BC or so, a little bit afterwards. So in Greece, this is the middle to late Bronze Age. And this ancestry diffuses across Greece, creating a cline of ancestry. So it's lower in the south and higher. That Western steppe ancestry is higher in the north, but it's really heterogeneous. So the average is about 25% ancestry from these Western steppe herders after 2000 BC, but it peaks at sort of 55% in some individuals in the north. And what's interesting is it's even heterogeneous on single sites. At single sites, you have people with next to none of this steppe ancestry and some people with none of it. So, and the sort of problem for thinking about the sort of sexual violence in Greek literature, in Greek myths, is that they're not from the corded-ware associated groups where we have this evidence of big male bias. The ancestry comes directly from the Yamnaya who are living on the steppe. So unlike other parts of Europe who are largely derived their ancestry from these initial corded-ware migrations from corded-ware, they actually derive their ancestry from migrations associated with the Yamnaya, where there's less the evidence for it being sort of a sex-specific migrations is sort of lesser. So there's, and in Greece generally, it's not a very straightforward, very complicated pattern of spread of these ancestries. So it's difficult to see how it can relate in a straightforward way. There's some evidence for male bias, so sex-biased, male biased admixture from the Y chromosome, but it's a bit variable and uncertain. There are new paternal lineages introduced that derive from the steppe, but there's no large turnover. A lot of the local paternal lineages persist. So certainly that Koros model of young men coming in and carrying off women doesn't apply to Greece at all, or at least not in a very straightforward and consistent way. And it's actually quite unclear what the mechanisms that drive language change are, because these steppe ancestors stay in the minority, and not only that, you're still getting sort of rich, elite burials, like the Griffin warrior who carry none of this Western steppe herder ancestry. Maybe is a bit too early and a bit too west to carry it at that stage. But one thing you could argue is that if sort of an elite took over and imposed their language on the population, then that might be one way of explaining the language change in Greece. But at least from this one individual that we have, who is clearly quite an elite individual, he doesn't have any of the Western steppe herder ancestries at that point. So yeah, just to conclude, so certainly migrations of people carrying steppe-related ancestries, we can say in general over hundreds of years was transformative the genetics, culture and language in Europe. And that the culture's beliefs of early Indo-European speakers on the Pontic-Caspian steppe probably is reflected in some way in those shared traits of the societies which they influenced. I think it's reasonable to hypothesize that periods involving sex by admixture may reflect times where sexualized violence was more common, although there could be other possible explanations. But in the problem is the DNA cannot provide strong evidence for it either way. They just maybe regions where we might think, perhaps this is more often happening at this time, when we look at other evidences as well in combination. And variability in the patterns of nature of migrations across Europe, these relate to specific events associated with movements of people across Europe. And there's Greece in particular, there's no obvious specific events. Greece is particularly difficult because of the variability that you see. And there's no obvious event that could be linked to sexualized violence in Greek myths. But it is plausible that Greek myths were influenced by the sort of vibe of Yamnaya people when they were on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. But we can't really see any processes that would link to that directly. But it might be, it's an interesting theory to think that they derive from stories that were originally told by people who were living on the Pontic Caspian steppe around 3000 BC. Thanks very much for listening. That was useful.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much. What we're going to do, and I'm not sure I mentioned it, we're going to go straight to the next paper, if that's okay, if that's all right with you, Florence. And then we see what we can do is max out the discussion at the end, if that's okay. So if you have questions, hold on to them. Hold on to them. And we try to go for papers that do complement each other anyway. So what I'm gonna do after just like a very brief thanks for you for getting things started in such an amazing way. What I'm going to do now is just briefly introduce our second speaker, who is Florence. Back here, it's Florence Felsheim. So Florence has come to us from St Andrews, where she's currently a PhD student, and she's done her previous degrees up there in St Andrews as well. Now, her master's thesis, completed a few years ago, is on an absolutely fascinating, seriously important topic, in my view. It's on reappraising the terminology of ancient Greek prostitution. And the PhD is very much growing out of this research. And what Frances is doing right now, under the direction of Sean Lewis, is taking via a comparative approach that looks at both Greek and Roman prostitution, it's basically, I suppose, to continue challenging, to receive ways of looking at the evidence and perhaps oversimplifying and maybe skewing the evidence. And what she is doing right now is using cognitive science as a lens for interpreting the ancient evidence. I hope that's okay.
That's great.
Very complex, exciting things you're doing. So may I please call you to the front?
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. There we go. So I'll be talking about a new way of approaching ancient sexualized violence in the ancient world. I'm going to specifically talk about cognitive sciences and how we can use cognitive sciences to get a clearer, deeper, better picture of what our ancient sources can tell us. So, what is cognitive sciences? It's essentially a field which focuses on understanding the human mind, the processes of human cognition. It encompasses actually quite a few disciplines. There's psychology, there's neuroscience, philosophy, anthropology, linguistics, even computer science. A couple of caveats there. Obviously, it's a very young field, still in full development. I'm not out here trying to sell it as like a foolproof science that can, absolutely be used for like absolute truth. But it is, I think, something that can absolutely help us decipher certain things that until then would have been maybe invisible to us in the sources. Obviously, again, another caveat is that things like psychology, neuroscience, they don't exist in a vacuum, and they actually also do have a bit of a history of being used for rather misogynistic purposes. So as long as we stay aware of potential pitfalls, like I said, believe can be a particularly fruitful tool for investigation of ancient sources. I'm specifically using it because I'm looking at the effects of sexual violence on human beings, and I found that cognitive sciences helps us frame it in a way that is not either sensationalizing it or dismissing it, minimizing it. In fact, it does what I think it should be doing, which is it humanizes it. It makes sure that we don't feel too distant from what happened 2,000 years ago, simply by virtue of it happening 2,000 years ago. So I'm going to be giving just a couple of insights into how this field can be used concretely to look at ancient sexual violence and gain further understanding of ancient sources. I'm going to be specifically focusing on prostitution. I'm going to define sexual violence rather broadly here and include cases where force takes different shape than physical force, or rests on threats of it. So especially sexual coercion, commodification, etc., etc. Prostitution in ancient Greece, I want to make sure to say something. I will not be approaching it from the lens of the language of sex work, which is something that has taken root in scholarship in recent years. And I'm doing that because prostitution in ancient Greece and ancient Rome was very much the product of things like wartime trafficking, chattel slavery, poverty, marginalization, and I believe that sex work actually kind of sanitizes those processes. I'm going to be talking about especially the repeated experience of sexual commodification. I'm going to be looking at a couple of psychological processes which all go around dissociation, which is essentially the transient loss of unity between your consciousness, your memory, your identity, and the perception of your environment. It's ultimately a temporary but harmful defense mechanism employed during or following a traumatic experience. And it is not actually to be confused with dissociative identity. So I'm going to be using 3 different case studies. So each one will have its own example from the ancient sources. And again, this is to give a couple of examples of how to use this concretely. So for disengagement, I will examine the self/body relationship through the case of Hetara behaviors named in Athenaeus' Daedalus Office 13. Strategies of disengagement and escapism are widely observable amongst people who are in situations of trafficking or prostitution because it's very natural. It's a disconnection from the moment and the body, which is a completely normal response to sexual violation. The ancient sources we have give us a real lexicon of disengagement. We've got escapism, so reluctance disguised as ambiguity, bluntness in the guise of socially acceptable jokes. For example, in Athenaeus, there is a moment where Hetera, called Phryne, has a client complaining to her that he has to pay a lot of money when the guy who was before him had to pay very, very little. And she tells him, well, wait until I desire you, and then you'll see how much I charge. So it's like this sort of reluctance disguised as witty banter that can give us certain insights into the action of reality. One that I find particularly interesting is the case of a Hetera called Metiha, who was a prostitute woman who lived in the 4th century. She was nicknamed Clepsydra, which is a water clock, because she had a habit of timing her encounters with a water clock and stopping abruptly when the agreed time was over. She was very much criticized for this and even had a play named after her. What I find interesting about this is that, first of all, it is absolutely something that still happens nowadays. If you go on certain Ponto forums, you will see absolutely people complaining that women in prostitution stare at the clock or have a very impersonal approach. And this sort of explicit disengagement from the moment and the buyer allows for dissociation, which many modern prostitute women report as a necessary coping mechanism for their occupation. And I really want to say that this is not some abstract notion. It's not a case of just like zoning out. Disengagement is very much a technical term. It's a very human response we can still find in the landscape of trafficking, of sexual violence today. And this phenomena actually also continues in Roman antiquity. There is an epigram by Martial, of course, where he talks about a woman called Chione, obviously a reference to the goddess of snow and cold. And he describes her as absent as if made of marble. And again, this is another instance where ancient narratives and modern life stories alike show that the corporal reality of prostituted and trafficked women is characterized by a paradoxical absent presence of their bodies. And it is true that people who experience this sort of like lack of sovereignty over their own bodies start to feel very, very estranged from themselves. And often developed what is called like estrangement of bodily experiences, which is characterized by, I mean, obviously we have only the external view of buyers, which in our modern terms is very biased. In the ancient world, we have to take them at their word. But every time there are like mentions of absence or reluctance in texts, this is something where we can actually dig a little bit deeper and find more evidence for what we're looking for. For objectification, which I'm going to explain a little bit further, I'm going to be using what Merleau-Ponty used as a concept of the lived or own body and of lived space in order to emphasize from a first-person perspective the connection between like the subject and the world. The objectification is an interesting thing to study because it functions both internally and externally. And it represents a tension between violation and a sense of empowerment. The example I'm going to be used for this one is a passage of Xenophon where Socrates meets the hetaira Theodote. So essentially, Socrates hears rumors from one of his friends about the beauty of this hetaira, and he decides to go pay her a visit with the friends. And they get to her house, and they find her in an unspecified state of undress, getting painted. And they look at her, and then Socrates asks, who profits the most from the situation? Us for getting to look at her, or her for having us look at her? Obviously, this is a rather intellectually dishonest way of looking at the situation, because what Socrates means when he talks about profit is very different. When he says, they profit from looking at her, they profit in a sexual way from, the circumstances that lead her to expose herself. When he talks about Theodote profiting, he means it in a material way. Like they're going to give her gifts, or they're going to talk more about her beauty in a way that is going to materialize in more profit for her. But obviously, he doesn't talk about the cost of being objectified by that. Because first of all, to show herself in this way to complete strangers, you can just walk into her house, Theodote must objectify herself. So again, internal objectification, and be objectified by them, which is external. Objectification is a constant and recurring phenomena in the lives of prostituted women because their occupation requires them to play into their biased view of them rather than representing themselves authentically. It's a form of body surveillance, which in itself is also dissociating from your own body in a certain level. Like there are different levels of dissociation. And this body surveillance, which is internal, is also reflected externally by the buyers. We also see this in texts from Philemon, in Xenarchus Pentathlon, in Ulysses Panicus. We have all this evidence of women being represented like cattle or products to be inspected, sampled, their bodies displayed as much as possible, and often linked in certain ways to animals, which contributes to what is called animalistic dehumanization. Modern cognitive sciences has shown that women's experiences of prostitution constitute a spectrum of disembodiment that is inflected, not determined, by settings and contexts. Hostile objectification, which is when the experience of objectification is being inflicted very regularly in very dehumanizing ways, leads to destructive behaviors such as unsafe drug use and concomitant bodily deteriorations. And this is where I'm going to transition into what I think is one of the most productive avenues of using cognitive sciences when it comes to studying ancient sexual violence, and that's the process of chemical dissociation. So what is meant by that? If you look at today's sex industry, it is very well known that many performers report not being able to go on set unless they're high on some drug. Be that an upper or, various people in prostitution generally, be that porn performers or escorts, dancers, streetwalkers, what have you, use varying levels of drugs and alcohol to cope with their occupation and emotionally detach themselves during the act. And looking at the sources, as I have for the best part of the past 4 years, I found that alcoholism is one of the most, if not the most, recurring stereotype of ancient prostitute women across Greek and Roman literary genres. It is especially visible in comedy, both Old and New, and Greek and Roman. Prostituted women of all ages are derided as drunks and alcoholics. Some were actually also given related nicknames. You've got Peroinos, which means drunken, or Ampedes, which is pine tree. And the text, what's interesting is that they don't just communicate this predilection, they actually they show that this addiction was a very well-known thing. Menander, in his play Samia, the Samian woman, puts the following words into the mouth of his character Demeas as he kicks out his concubine, the Hetira Chrysis, because he believes that she cheated on him. So here he says, "Oh, what a noble creature! In town you'll see exactly what you are. Whores like you, Chrysis, run from dinner to dinner, where you charge a mere 10 drachmas, and knock back unmixed wine until you die of it. Or if you don't fight a quick and ready death, you starve slowly. But I'm sure you'll know this just as well as anyone." So this passage is actually interesting for two reasons. The first is because we have the mention of unmixed wine, which is actorton, a very, very strong drink with a high percentage of alcohol. Like I was saying before, modern cognitive sciences has shown that alcohol and drug use among prostitute women are associated with high rates of cliental violence, particularly sexual violence, which is unfortunately consistent with the antique source material. There are also other conditions, violence, homelessness, malnutrition, which are explored here, which are conducive to bodily deterioration and mental health decline. As the scholar Caravaggio said, the fact that the sex trade is founded upon the absence of mutual desire means that the principal predicament becomes how to endure repeated sexual abuse. For this reason, psychological and somatic dissociation have been observed in a number of studies on trafficked and prostituted people, as again, dissociation is a normal response to sexual violation, and chemical dissociation is one of the last resort options. It's why I've had this as last example, because really it is the strongest indication that you do not want to be there, that you are detaching yourself. Modern research on the sex industry, and specifically through branches of psychology and neuroscience, has correlated substance use with physical and sexual violence, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative tendencies, depression, anxiety, high levels of stress, and also childhood sexual abuse. And unfortunately, this is something that was very likely to have happened in the ancient world as well. And our sources do show this, whether it is comedy or, right now I'm thinking especially of Against Neaira, which is one of the most scathing indictments of prostitution in the ancient world, because she did start as a very, very young child and is also characterized as, drinking lots of alcohol. There is another passage that is also very interesting. It's this fragment from Ferracrates' play Coriano, which very strongly echoes the previous passage. The fragment shows that a prostituted woman visits her in a domestic setting, getting a cup of wine from her slave girl, Lyke. And she complains that the wine is all water and asks how it was mixed. To which the answer is 2 parts water, 4 parts wine. Now, usually wine is mixed at the ratio of 1 to 3, so 1 part wine, 3 parts water. And the woman says, "Oh, go to the crows. This is wine for frogs," like saying, "Oh, it's all water." So essentially, it's the equivalent of her holding up a glass of whiskey and saying, "What is this, an IPA?" And obviously, undiluted wine is a very, very strong thing. In Greek mythology, it was used to, knock out a cyclops. So comedic exaggeration, sure. But there's no joke without, something to make fun of in the first place. And this, again, confirms the knowledge of alcoholism and addiction to strong substances in prostituted women. On that note, the name of the prostitute woman, which is Koreana, strikingly is also a joke, based on the coriander plant, which needed a lot of watering, and is therefore an apt nickname for a woman who drinks quite a bit. Getting back to Menander, the second interesting thing about the passage is that the idea of the situation, which essentially is survival prostitution, is very common knowledge. He says, clearly, oh, this happens all the time, and you're going to end up like this, and you're going to see just what it's like. Hundreds of years later, we have Aristanitis, who made a sweeping but seemingly accepted generalization in one of his fictional letters. He says, and when it comes to drinking wine, you Dionysus, we can simply look amongst ourselves, the Tyri, no further example is needed. The fact that this is such a wide-ranging phenomenon that we find again and again and again in our sources speaks to just how widespread this phenomenon was, this phenomenon of trying to, dissociate at any cost, using substances that are strong and very dangerous as well in order to achieve this goal. It is, in fact, also a form of self-harm in a lot of ways, which is also one of the most extreme ways of dissociation and disengagement, and also a way of paradoxically coping with all of the emotions that being in these situations elicits. You've got lots of shame, because there's a big, big stigma about these occupations. There is obviously skyrocketing levels of depression, of anxiety about the future. Addiction is, I think it's very obvious, but addiction is about fundamentally not wanting to be there in the present moment, wanting to escape as much as you can. We have in modern day a lot of research about all these phenomena. We have a lot of research about what addiction does. We have lots of research about what repeated sexual abuse does. We have research about what sexualized violence entails, how it's being coped with, what are the survival strategies. And it is longer overdue, that we apply that lens to the ancient corpus and the human reality of all of these ancient people, especially ancient women. Before I slow the conclusion. So this was a very quick presentation aimed at showing what insights we can gain from looking at the ancient corpus from the point of view of cognitive sciences. Obviously, I wanted to show that dissociation, which is one of the main things we can get, presents itself in a range of different ways. Parallels between ancient and modern experiences are made visible, which also allows us for a more nuanced and humanizing approach to the texts. I think it's especially needed in the study of sexual violence, specifically ancient prostitution, because so many of the behaviors that I've addressed are superficially dealt with in a lot of scholarship, or sanitized or glamorized in order to facilitate a certain point of view of the ancient sex trade. There are a lot of other things that I really wish I could say, but I will end on this note that cognitive science is not just about, can't only be used for the point of view of the victim, the person who experiences sexual violence itself. In my research, I make sure to address the three key components, which is the victim, the perpetrator, and the sociocultural atmosphere surrounding it. I don't think that you can really study this only from the point of view of one of the three. And I find that there's not much research on, for example, the clients or the slave owners. And I think it's really, really important to apply this sort of research to them as well, try and isolate, what cognitive dissonances we find. And also in terms of, sorry, the social cultural atmosphere, what processes, what socialization aspects, what ideas about gender facilitate and justify this. And again, unfortunately, I find there are a lot of parallels between the Asian and Hmong world in that regard. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much.